I saw a video today about Christian nationalism from a guy named Jamie Bambrick, and I haven't talked about political stuff in my channel a whole lot, but I've been researching Christian nationalism on my own, and I just want to put my 2 cents out there because I think his video is well-meaning, but he makes some mistakes in it. I posted a comment on the video going through some of that stuff, and actually in the comment I said I might as well just make a video about it, so here we go. All right, this is Jamie. His channel is called just Jamie Bambrick. I recommend you go check out his video. It's called Secularism's Big Lie, Why No Nation Can Be Religiously Neutral. I've just got a couple of timestamps I'm going to jump through, and we'll talk about it. All right, so he's about to give his own definition of Christian nationalism, which modifies Stephen Wolfe's definition. If you don't know, Stephen Wolfe wrote the book called The Case for Christian Nationalism. He's not the only Christian nationalist out there, but he's probably the most popular, except maybe Doug Wilson. Uh, let's go back a second. This definition: a Christian nation is a nation that is conscious of itself as a Christian nation and acts for itself as a Christian nation. Now, I think this is pretty much a circular definition because nowhere does it define what a Christian or what a nation actually is. He goes through some of those things in the book, sort of. He defines a nation, I think, pretty well, but he doesn't define Christian very well. He just takes a generic Reformed tradition and then runs with it. But a Reformed tradition is not monolithic, there's lots of variation in that. Anyway, if you take this definition, you get a Christian nation is a nation that acts like it's Christian, which doesn't really tell you a whole lot. Now, Jamie goes ahead and makes his own definition, which I'll put on the screen here. There we go. A Christian nation is one whose founding principles, laws, and cultural identity are rooted in Christianity, and which upholds the scripture as the guiding ideal for public life. In other words, a nation that seeks to follow the will of God on the national level. So there's a couple issues that I have with this. It is more, or it is less vague than Stephen Wolfe's definition, but it still doesn't really give you a whole lot because it just says it's rooted in Christianity, but we don't know how granular that is. We don't know all the details around that. What exactly do you mean by Christian? For example, would Jehovah's Witnesses and Mormons be considered Christian in your Christian nation? That's going to be a question that you have to figure out if you want to make a Christian nation. He also says that it's a nation or a nation that seeks to follow the will of God on the national level. I think that also is a bit vague. The national level is probably going to end up being government and politics. That's just what people typically assume when we talk about the national level. It's not families, it's not churches, it's not colleges or schools or anything like that. It's the political entity in the country. Following the will of God there, that's going to be very difficult and dicey, I'll say, because even in Scripture, you have the state being defined as the entity that wields the sword, and that means the entity that punishes evil on earth. So punishes crimes, things like that. But moral issues, well, I won't take away all moral issues, but a lot of moral issues that have to do with religious things are not crimes. And so they're not to be dealt with by the state. So when we're talking about a state following the will of God, we have to make sure we draw our boundaries so that it's only talking about the things that the state really should control.
Here's the problem with that and why the idea of a neutral nation as the ideal doesn't work. The fact is that law is never religiously neutral. All law is, at its core, religious. All law makes religious claims. For instance, the idea that murder is wrong, or let's say theft or some other, largely agreed upon crime.
Okay, so he says that all laws legislate some kind of morality, which I would agree with. And he even says that they're all some sort of religious claim, which probably I would agree with. The thing is, this is the first thing that I mentioned in my comment that I posted on his video. There's a sort of idea of a false dilemma in this video. So the dilemma is you either accept the secular, postmodern, neutral world that we have out there right now, like in America, for example. I mean, everywhere in the West, but most notably in America. or you accept whatever is defined in the video as Christian nationalism, and there's no third way, there's no middle of the road, there's no place for nuance. I think that's really problematic, to use a way overused word. The reason for that is because I think there's at least one other option, which is Christian liberty. I'm not excluding any other possible options people come up with, but Christian liberty says this is a nation that is Christian, generally. The people are Christian. We're going to follow Christian morality. But one of the things included in that is liberty of conscience for people. So you can't have coercion, you can't have compulsion. The boundaries of that you're going to have to define because it's vague, it's complex. But generally, you can't have compulsion of religion in a society. That's why in America, for example, we have freedom of religion, because the people who started this country, who were steeped in years and years and years and decades and centuries of Christian tradition, agreed that you can't have compulsion. If you have a Christian nation that you define as something that is a lot more stringent than Christian liberty, I think you are, even with the best intentions, you are inevitably going to get some kind of compulsion. I have a couple of screenshots from Stephen Wolf's book on the side here. I'm just going to read them, but I'll put them on the screen so you can see. This is Stephen Wolf in his book, The Case for Christian Nationalism, talking about a Christian society. A Christian society that is for itself, so a Christian nation, will distrust atheists, decry blasphemy, correct any dishonoring of Christ, orient life around the Sabbath, frown on and suppress moral deviancy, and repudiate neo-Anabaptist attempts to subvert a durable Christian social order. A Christian nation that is true to itself will unashamedly and confidently assert Christian supremacy over the land. Now, there's a whole lot of stuff packed in here. Never mind the fact that in the New Testament, the land is never talked about as the earth, as it is in the Old Testament. You don't just get the Old Testament idea of dominion over the land like ancient Israel did. In the New Testament, it's spiritualized. Anyway, the problematic points that I want to point out here are the things about Sabbath laws. Now, I couldn't find the quote from the book where he actually more explicitly advocates not only Sabbath laws, but blasphemy laws. But this will do. He says a Christian society will orient itself around the Sabbath. It will decry blasphemy and correct any dishonoring of Christ. Any dishonoring of Christ. The thing with this book, with Stephen Wolf putting out this book, this was 2022, I think this was him sort of trying to dip his toes in the water of exposing himself as a Christian nationalist while also trying to toe the line of people who would have panicked if he came out more strongly. So here he says, we're going to correct any dishonoring of Christ, which sounds great. Like, as a Christian, you want to honor Christ. You want our societies to honor Christ. But there's no safeguard here. This is another thing that I mentioned in my comment to Jamie's video. There's no safeguards going on here. If you read Stephen Wolf's book, you'll find that he sort of vaguely talks about things like not coercing people. Actually, he does mention it, that true faith is not coerced. Like, I'm grateful that he says that. But at the same time, he lays down this foundation of Christian nationalism, of doing certain things from a distinctly Presbyterian point of view, and having no safeguards against the extremes of those points of view. So maybe we can decry blasphemy. Sure. Maybe we can reorient our lives around the Sabbath. Sure. But there's no safeguards against that becoming sort of like Sharia law with blasphemy laws, and then some kind of compulsion around the Sabbath. Elsewhere in his book, he talks about sort of penalizing people for not going to church on Sunday. So he's even pushing that ball down the hill already, and I can only see it getting worse, not better.
Why do people think that they are? Why do people think that Western secular values are neutral. Well, the truth is that what most people think are secular values, and let's say life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, for instance, right? People think we can get there from secularism. Well, they're not actually derived from secularism. They are borrowed from Christianity. They are drawn from the Christian faith very explicitly.
I totally agree with Jamie here, and I just want to say, Jamie, if you're watching this, I have no idea if you will, but maybe you will. One of the things that is drawn from the Christian faith that we love in our societies today is liberty of conscience, religious liberty explicitly. There's other liberties too, but this is what we're talking about here. Religious liberty matters. It doesn't mean that we never evangelize and we live in persecution all the time and we build up other religions so that Christians can feel like we always have somebody to evangelize to. It doesn't mean that. But it also doesn't mean uh, accelerating the decline of society and doing things from the top-down point of view and not having safeguards against them so that it eventually gets to compulsion of religion. That is my main concern. Here's another example from the case for Christian nationalism. Stephen Wolfe says about the idea of a Christian prince, which is sort of a Christian magistrate or leader in the country. Though in the meantime, we may need to settle for civil leaders who fail to live up to the standards of a Christian prince, we should pray that God would raise up such a leader from among us, one who would suppress the enemies of God and elevate his people. There's other things he says in this sentence, but really that is the one I want to focus on the most. How do you know who an enemy of God is? How do you know what constitutes suppressing them? Where do you stop that suppression? How do you know who are your people? How do you elevate them? Where do you stop that elevation? These questions are not answered in his book. It's more of just a call to action or a rallying cry. We need this thing to happen now or else our country is going to explode, something like that. But nowhere does he go, we can do this and go no further. It's just leaving the door wide open. And I don't think that Jamie is going to agree with everything from this book. He and Stephen Wolfe aren't the same person, right? They're going to disagree about something. I don't even know if he's read this book, but if he's going to quote Stephen Wolfe, he needs to know what the guy says in his book, and I think this stuff is concerning. One more quote. To be a good member of the people, one must be a Christian, at least outwardly, and anyone who denies Christ in word or deed is subject to social separation or other social costs. Does that not sound like it could easily get to the idea of shunning like you see in Jehovah's Witnesses? That is something that causes so much strife within their cult. And it's leaving the door open for that. It says social separation. What does that even mean? Are we going to go to the extreme of putting people in internment camps or something like that because they deny Christ in word or deed? Or is it just going to be some kind of campaign to, I don't know, guilt people into going to church and at least outwardly being Christian so that they can connect with their friends and family? How far does this go? We don't know. Jamie, again, if you're watching, are you willing to sign up for this? Because there's nothing to stop it from going to the extreme.
Best place for this is Matthew 28, verse 18 to 20. It says, And Jesus came and said to them, All authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. Go therefore and make disciples of some people in lots of different countries. No, wait. Of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, teaching them to observe all that I have commanded you. And behold, I am with you always to the end of the age. So just to clarify, what are we told to make disciples of? People from all nations, is that it? No, I mean, it includes that, but no. The word there is ethne. It means people groups, whole cultures, societies, top to bottom. So yes, individuals, but also families, also lots of other institutions, and yes, including the politics of those nations.
I'm not going to get into a whole discussion about what ethne means, how exactly we're going to be granular about baptizing all nations, whether it's individual or corporate or any of that kind of stuff. My concern is the whole political thing, as it's been for the rest of this video. When we say we're going to attack this sort of thing from the top down and sort of baptize the politics of a nation so that it's Christian, I feel like I'm repeating myself here, but we have to be careful that it doesn't go too far. I would say that grassroots alone is not the right direction to change society. You do need some form of top down blessing from the elites or the powerful in society. But also, just coming from the top down is not going to be effective. If you just have people in government trying to force the nation to turn around and become Christian, that doesn't necessarily mean that all the people are just going to say, okay, we'll do that. You're going to cause a lot more strife than you are going to fix problems.
They should also enact the laws that God commands, right? Jesus, by the way, once again, reaffirms all of the Old Testament.
Okay, this is sort of a side note, maybe a nitpick. I'm not going to be too harsh here. But Jesus does not affirm all of the Old Testament, at least in the way that I think you're trying to say it. Jesus did fulfill all of the Old Testament, and he said not a jot or tittle is going to pass away until all of that is complete. However, he's not saying at the same time that all of the laws of the Old Testament apply to all nations today. And I think you would agree, Jamie, not all the nations today are going to be building their temples and sacrificing animals, right? Not all the nations today are going to have certain purity laws or food laws or anything like that, like they did in the Old Testament. Lots of the morality is going to, um, what's the word? It's going to come over into New Testament times. We can agree about that. But in the same vein of my concern with Stephen Wolfe, this is just a very vague statement that you made that can be taken way too broadly, way too widely, and leaves way too much of a door open for people to corrupt what you are saying. So, this is my urge to you and to everybody who is even interested in Christian nationalism or politics in general. We have to be careful about what we say. We have to be careful about not being vague, being very precise with what we say so that people don't take it the wrong way. You're only responsible for the way that you say things. You're not responsible for how people interpret them. I'll put that out there. But at the same time, you can leave the door way too wide open. Let's not do that. If you're interested in talking about or learning about Christian nationalism and responses to it, a couple things I'd recommend. There's a few channels. Um, Caldwell Apologetics. He comes from a Reform perspective and he critiques Christian nationalism pretty well. Bob the Baptist, he comes from obviously a Baptist background and it's sort of semi reformed, and he is also critiquing Christian nationalism pretty well. I'd recommend reading the article from Brian Matson called The Children's Crusade, because that is specifically a response to Stephen Wolfe's version of Christian nationalism that has not been responded to well, as far as I can tell. It's a pretty good argument that sort of dismantles the whole book. And other than that, I'd say there's a few books from a guy named P. Andrew Sandlin, who is the editor for these books. One is called The Sanctified State, and one is called Virtuous Liberty. I'd recommend you read both of those. So, great sources of good critiques of Christian nationalism and also presenting other options out there like Christian liberty. All right, thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.